could I first ask your reaction to what we heard from Premier Ford? Canada clearly does not feel like it wants to accept a bad deal from the United States, and yet the U.S. Still seems like it's ready and willing to wage this trade war. Is this exactly what the United States doesn't need right now, is another trade war, higher tariffs and potentially higher prices?
Look, I think we'll get this resolved. I was encouraged listening to the premier say at the end there, let's make a deal, let's make a deal. Listen, Donald Trump has demonstrated that the threat of tariffs is an incredible incentive to bring our trading partners to the table, to incentivize them to open up their markets, to lower their own tariffs, to remove non-tariff barriers. I think that is a very positive thing. There are two camps within the Trump administration. There's one camp that wants the threat of tariffs to be used in that direction, to lower tariffs, to expand trade. I'm emphatically in that camp. There is a second camp in the administration that just wants high tariffs in perpetuity. I think that camp is misguided. So what I'm hopeful is the resolution here will be that Canada will come to the table and we'll end up with more trade with Canada. Our farmers exporting more beef, more corn, more soybeans, more American goods, more American booze. All of that I'd like to see happen. And I think this is part of the back and forth, hopefully, to get to that point.
Well, that's a really interesting answer, Senator, and we really appreciate your listening to the interview before you joined us today. Clearly you did, because, look, the options sometimes are limited. If you're not buying potash from Canada, your option is to go buy it from Russia. So a deal, it seems, might help ranchers in Texas just as much as farmers in the Midwest.
Well, and Canada is an enormous energy producer. You look at Calgary and Alberta, they have massive oil and gas reserves. Their oil and gas producers work very closely with Texas refineries. So all of that, our economies are interconnected. And my hope is that the end result of all of this back and forth is we end up with an agreement that has more trade all around. If that's the case, that's good for Texas and it's good for Americans.
Yeah.
Senator, I'd like to ask you about whether another question is good for Americans, and that's data center development. This is a hot issue across the country, but especially so in Texas, where both now the man running to be your colleague in the Senate, Ken Paxton, and Governor Abbott seem to have turned against data centers. Is that the only way to win in your state or across the country in this midterm cycle, be anti-data center?
Well, listen, I think it is critical that America win the race for AI, but I also think the concerns being raised about data centers are real and reasonable, and they need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed head on. It's worth noting that this anti-data center movement is not entirely organic, that China is putting real money into funding this movement. You've got this guy, Neville Roy Singham, who is a Marxist. He's a communist American billionaire who lives in China, who is funding much of this. But and from China's perspective, they want us to never build another data center and basically cede all of AI to them. That would be a bad outcome.
So
what are real concerns?
Or Governor Abbott falling for Chinese propaganda?
No, because if you look at what they're saying, I agree with what they're saying. The concerns the voters have are twofold on data centers. Number one, water. Number two, power. Water is a very real concern. Here's the good news. Virtually all new data centers being built use what's called closed-loop cooling, which means they use the same water and just circulate it over and over and over again. So their water consumption is very, very low. I agree with Governor Abbott, who's putting rules in place that say if you're going to build a data center, you have to minimize your water consumption so you don't consume too much of the water from the community. That makes sense. Number two, voters are understandably concerned about electricity prices. Electricity prices have risen 30% since 2021, and a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet. I agree with what Governor Abbott has said, which is no new data center will be built in Texas unless the impact of that data center is zero, is absolutely not 1 penny added to anyone's electricity bills. I think that makes sense. And I'll tell you, I'm urging the companies that are building these data centers go further than that. Make the benefits absolutely clear and indisputable. I'm urging them send checks to the residents of the community. Send them $100 a month. Send them $500 a month. Send them $1,000 a month. Or even better, say if we build a data center in your community, for the rest of your life, your electricity bill is free. we will pay your electricity bill.
Wow.
That's how you win the PR battle, is you make the benefit. Suddenly people will be like, hot diggity damn, I like that data center because I don't pay a power bill. That's how you win these fights.
I'd love to see this in practice, Senator, because you're probably onto something when it comes to the sales pitch, knowing that a lot of the newer data centers are actually fulfilling the requirements that you just mentioned in terms of closed-loop cooling, off-grid, or what, off behind-the-meter, as they call it, energy flows. I wonder if these flock cameras are coming next, and you'll see where I'm going with this, because we do want to get to your book. This is something that everybody's talking about as well, and there's Republican legislation to ban federal spending on these flock cameras. Wall Street Journal today says there are 120,000 of them in 48 states, capturing 20 billion license plates a month. This feels like the next data center issue on the campaign trail. What would a Justice Clarence Thomas make of this?
Well, look, I'll tell you what a Ted Cruz would make of it, which is I don't like flock cameras. I don't like government surveillance. I don't think the government should be surveilling innocent citizens. We should use law enforcement to go after criminals, but we have a presumption of innocence. And I think the surveillance state, China has built an espionage and surveillance state. I don't want to see America the same way. I think these flock cameras really invite abuse, and I'm hopeful the political process will constrain it.
Well, so maybe the political and not the judicial process. I think, Senator, what Joe is getting to here is a question of civil liberties and constitutional rights and whether or not they are being violated in this instance. These are, of course, the very questions that Justice Thomas has been dealing with through his tenure on the court. And your book is about his legacy on the court and the background that, of course, got them there and shaped his judicial view. But what will his legacy be reflected, or how will people reflect upon his legacy, knowing he was sitting on the bench at a time when we saw public confidence in the Supreme Court fall to an all-time low? It's just at 33% right now, Senator.
Well, I think Clarence Thomas's legacy is going to be one of the most extraordinary jurists to ever serve on the court. I know Justice Thomas very well. He's a good friend. We've been friends for 30 years. I wrote this book, Going Further, The Incomparable Clarence Thomas, to tell his life story, because I'll tell you, Kailey, his life story, it is inspirational, it is extraordinary, it is unique. There's no one else on the court with a life story remotely like this. He was born into abject poverty in rural Georgia. He was born at a time of bitter racism and discrimination. He came from nothing. He studied in the seminary to be a priest. We almost didn't get Justice Thomas. We almost got Father Thomas. But he left the seminary because he was unhappy. He thought the church was not being vigorous enough, standing up to racial discrimination, standing up and fighting for civil rights. And so he left the church for many years. He went to Holy Cross for college and then Yale Law School, and he became a left-wing campus radical. He was an angry young man in camo pants and combat boots and a poster of Malcolm X on the wall. He participated in a riot in Harvard Square. And what I try to do in this book is number one, tell his life story, taking him from poverty all the way up to the pinnacle of American law, but also chronicle his intellectual transformation from an angry left-wing radical to one of the most important conservative thinkers in the world. Justice Thomas is today the second longest-serving justice on the Supreme Court. In 2 years, he will be the longest-serving justice in American history. And what this book tries to do is explain 30 years of jurisprudence in language that is understandable, that is accessible. You don't have to be a lawyer to enjoy this book. This book is fun, and it has stories inside the court, who Clarence Thomas is. Justice Thomas sat one-on-one with me for 9.5 hours of exclusive interviews. And so I'm telling this story so that you can understand a truly consequential figure of history who is about to be the longest-serving justice ever.
Well, the narrative is great as we consider the man in Chapter 10, the lone wolf. You bring us into the conference room of the Supreme Court where then Chief Justice William Rehnquist said, affirm. He was followed by one justice after another, all saying affirm, until it came to a young Clarence Thomas, speaking last in order of seniority, as you point out, who said reverse. Whatever the other 8 justices of the Supreme Court said, Justice Thomas was willing to say the opposite. And as you write, he was not doing this to be interesting. So, Senator, what was the exercise?
Listen, he is someone who is deeply principled. The reason for the title of the book, Going Further. He is the justice most willing to go back to the Constitution, go back to the original understanding. If a precedent is wrong, to overturn it. And he has a faithfulness and fidelity to the Constitution that is unique. You know, he was raised by his grandfather. He was born into a single mom in really dire circumstances. His grandparents raised him, and his grandfather was a very strict disciplinarian. Myers Anderson was his name, and young Clarence called him Daddy. And he would work Clarence and his brother to the bone. He'd get him up at 3 and 4 in the morning to deliver fuel oil in the bitter cold. He wouldn't let the boys wear gloves because he thought gloves were for the weak. But he taught discipline and hard work. And both Justice Thomas's grandparents were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. But they encouraged in Clarence reading. He could go to the library and read and study. And that attitude, there was a common sense self-reliance that he got from his grandfather. His grandfather didn't consider himself a conservative, but for example, even though they lived in poverty, his grandfather told young Clarence they would never go on welfare because his grandfather said if you take welfare from the government, you give the government a reason, an ability to come into your house and tell you what to do, and it's none of their business. And one of my favorite things that Justice Thomas's grandfather told him is he said, if it don't make no damn sense, it don't make no damn sense. That common sense through line is in Justice Thomas's jurisprudence throughout.